Okay. I do. Just get the signal. I'm happy with that. Exactly. Okay. I'll go check with Jesus and maybe we'll get started.
Just going to use the mic and I'll use the mic.
Exactly. So it'll go from Arden to Jesus to you. So.
Right now.
Yeah, feel free. Your wife. I don't know if the Wi-Fi was.
It's on my. I tried and it did not. Did not want to give me
Do you think it's downloaded? It'll work. I believe.
Say again?
It'll work, right? It's downloaded. Okay.
Yeah, it's on my
Okay.
computer.
Perfect. Okay.
I
Sounds
don't
great.
have anything
Awesome.
Going to a link or anything.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you.
It does never work.
Yeah, it doesn't sometimes.
I think so.
Okay. Sounds good.
I'll just go grab them.
Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Arden Cook. I'm a student forum host here at the Hinckley Institute of Politics. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum, presented as a part of the Dalmas Nelson Lecture Series, is titled Ethics in Contentious Elections. We're excited to partner with the Division of Public Affairs for this event. I will now turn it over to Professor Jesus Valero to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Jesus Valero, and I'm an associate professor and director of the MPA program in the Division of Public Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. Before getting started, I want to acknowledge a few folks that are here in the room today, starting with Ada and Brent Nelson, family members, son of the late Dalmas Nelson. Please stand up. Thank you. Nick Loffrich is here as well, who is a Regents Professor Emeritus at Washington State University. Thank you for being here. And also Chair of our new Division of Public Affairs, David Carter. Thank you for being here as well. So since 1994, the Dalmas Nelson Lecture in Public Law and Ethics has sponsored a number of different lectures across time, inviting distinguished speakers and thought leaders and practitioners of public administration to continue to raise the conversation about the importance of ethics in public law in our field. Initially established through small gifts from family, colleagues, friends, and others, the lectures honor Dalmas Nelson's lifelong commitment to ethics and administrative law in public administration. One of 8 children of a potato farmer from southeastern Idaho, Dalmas Nelson went on to a storied career as a professor, activist, and innovator in public administration. He co-founded the University of Utah's MPA program, which is celebrating 50 years very soon here. So thank you to Dalmas for helping us co-found our program. His students at the U, where he taught for over 2 decades, highly respected him for teaching them to think and to write. He won the U's Excellence in Teaching Award and the coveted Chopin Prize for his Harvard PhD dissertation. I would like to invite one of our special guests today, Nicholas Loveridge, who would like to say a few words about Dalmas and Kim as well. So, Nick, would you come up, please?
Thank you. I'm honored that the Nelson family is here, and I want to congratulate the university and the program for maintaining the lectureship series, and I hope it is an annual event of import, as this one will be. I had a small hand in getting Kim Wyman to come and be our speaker today, and I'm proud of that, very proud. But I'm also very proud of your dedication to Dalmas's legacy. He has a phenomenal legacy. I knew him not as a student, but as a colleague, a precious colleague who helped mentor me through my career. And if it wasn't for Dalmas, I wouldn't have been at all successful in what I wanted to study, was public personnel administration, ethics in public administration. And we teamed up. It turns out my wife is from Salt Lake City, so we came to Salt Lake every Christmas. And Dalmas and I would get together and dream up new schemes of how to improve practice and theory in public personnel administration. So I wanted to come and meet you, the family, and I wanted to hear Kim speak today. And I want to add to this legacy of Dalmas Nelson at the University of Washington. It's Washington, I'm from Washington, University of Utah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you. All right. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Kim Wyman is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center with over 30 years of state, federal, and county level elections experience. She's committed to improving election administration and has worked diligently to ensure our nation's elections remain accessible, secure, and accurate. Previously, Wyman served as a senior election security advisor for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Before that, she was elected as the Washington Secretary of State and Thurston County Auditor. Wyman began her career in election administration as the Thurston County Elections Director. She's a graduate of the California State University, Long Beach University, and earned an MPA from Troy State University. She earned state and national election administration certifications and served in leadership roles in many civic and professional associations. A leader of national renown, Wyman often shares award-winning innovative lectures and conversations around election administration and cybersecurity practices with organizations across the country. She has received numerous awards and distinctions, including induction into the Election Center Hall of Fame in 2022 for her contributions to the election community. Welcome, Kim Wyman, to the University of Utah.
All right, well, it is truly an honor. Okay, it's working good. It's truly an honor to be here, and thank you for the Nelson series. I'm butchering it. I'm starting off just tripping out of the gate, and we're good. Thank you so much, Nelson family, for inviting me and sponsoring this series. It is really an honor to be here. I was on this campus about 15 years ago and working on an election project, and it's just nice to be back on campus in this capacity, and I'm really honored to be part of this program. So today what I want to do is walk through this idea of ethics in contentious elections. And luckily, I think we're going into an election that's going to be really smooth. No one's going to have any problems. It's going to be great. Let me start by taking you back to right before the 2020 election. So when I think back on 2019 as we were preparing for the 2020 election, I can tell you that the singular biggest things on my mind was Russian hacking. We had a lot, and I'll go into this in a bit, but we had a lot of issues in 2016 with foreign actors trying to get into election systems. And so that was really at the top of our minds. We were preparing between 2016 and 2020. To be honest, none of us could have predicted what 2020 held. And it definitely has left a mark on all of us, some good, some not so good. But let's start with just a level set. When we think about ethics, and I think that Britannica, I just pulled this straight out of off the internet, you know, the idea of what is ethics. And I think that the second one is really the heart of this. Ethics inform, but singular or plural in construction, the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group. And one of the things that I think we've all experienced in the last couple of years is this seems to be waning. So I want to start with a question for all of you, particularly the students in the room. Whose ethics matter most in our elections? This is just a suggestion, but whose ethics matter most? Feel free, this is interactive, it's not going to be boring.
The Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor.
Secretaries of State, Lieutenant Governors, the chief election officials in their respective states, definitely. Anyone else? I mean, Secretaries of State are pretty big and important, so I could see how you would think that that was the most important. But is that the most important? Yes?
Turns out the candidates.
The candidates. And you have all lived through what happens when a candidate may not adhere to tradition or social norms or the ethics of past generations. Election officials, absolutely, absolutely. Why? Why does it matter? Why does ethical behavior matter in our elections in the United States in 2024?
Integrity of the process.
Integrity of the process, but what matters about the process? Why do all of you care, beyond who wins or loses an election, why do you care about how election officials conduct the election, how candidates react in an election?
Because you are acting in a representation of the people and their sovereignty.
Absolutely. So you might even go so far as to say that elections are kind of the foundational element of our representative democracy. So what happens when we have people who don't behave ethically? A very dear friend of mine, Charles Stewart, who is a genius professor at MIT, founded a lab at MIT after the 2008 election. And he started doing a survey that they have done every year, every 2 years since, in every federal election, surveying election officials and voters to get a feel for how the election went. And coming out of 2020, one of the questions, and these questions each year are the same questions, so they have this great rich data now from 2008 to 2020. And it was, how confident are you that the votes at whatever level they're asking were counted as cast or intended by the voter? And what you may notice about this bar graph is that when you're talking about the local office, your vote, I'm very confident or highly confident that my vote was counted the way that I cast it. And what you'll notice is that at each level that gets away from the voter, their confidence level gets less. So a county, yes, I think those county people did it well. Ooh, but I'm not really sure about the state, if they really did that right. And boy, you start talking about nationally, our state's great, Utah rocks, but I don't know about. And this one I think isn't going to come to as a big surprise. This bar graph shows the same question, essentially, of how confident are you nationwide that the votes were counted as cast. And you'll notice that Democrats, especially after 2020, the confidence level went up. In Republicans, it dipped significantly. But the good news is it rebounded a bit in 2022. But why should we care? I mean, it's just a handful of Republicans that are certain that the election was rigged. We should care because if we don't believe in the institution of our elections, we don't believe that the people who are elected are legitimate. And that starts undermining the foundation of our country. So today, what I'm going to do is kind of talk about three things. The first one is I want to share with you the 5 elections that I believe really changed everything. Second, I want to talk about the incentives, the risks, and the rewards of ethical behavior, or maybe unethical behavior. And then leave you with some ideas of what you can do to have hope. Now, I'm going to talk about some things that might bum you out, but I promise we're going to end on a good note. I promise. Bear with me. All right, so I know it feels like right now what happened in 2020 and what we're anticipating happening in 2024 is new. It's never happened in our country's history, but I can tell you, and I'm not good at history, but I can tell you it's not new. It goes back really to the early days of the founders starting to have elections in the first place. And the framers of the Constitution envisioned things, and it doesn't always go the way they planned. So if you look at the modern era, and I really count that as the last 24 years, so I know it feels like 2020 was this big revolutionary thing, but really we are on the anniversary of an election that I believe fundamentally changed the way people behave around elections, and that was the 2000 election. So the 2000 presidential election was game-changing on a number of levels. So election night, historically, when elections had wider margins, historically, the news media outlets, oh, let me ask a real fun question. How many of you can remember a time that we knew who won the election night? Please raise your hands. How many of you can remember that? Okay, all of you put your hands down because we've never known election night. We have never known the winners in any state in the union because there's a period after election day called the canvass where election officials work to make sure everything was accurate. The media calls elections. Election officials just count votes and tell you what they counted. And that's important later. So in 2000, the media had this machine. They were really good at predicting, and they made a mistake. And they called the election for Al Gore. Except for Tim Russert on NBC, and he has a whiteboard, and I know many of you in this room probably weren't even born in 2000, but he had a whiteboard on election night as the returns were coming in, and he wrote on the whiteboard, Florida, Florida, Florida. And all night he kept pointing to, it's gonna come down to Florida. When you look at the Electoral College, it's too close to call. He was spot on, he was the only one that got it right. And it turns out Florida became the epicenter of that election. And I was an election official at the county level in 2000, and I was very thankful for Florida because our state, Washington, had a Senate race that decided the US Senate, control of the US Senate, Slade Gordon versus Maria Cantwell. And that race, out of a few million votes cast, was separated by about 1,400 votes, which sounds close. In election terms, it's really not. But we were worried that if Florida hadn't happened, all those lawyers from DC would come to Washington. So we were like, yeah, they're doing good over there. Just keep watching them. We're just gonna do our business over here. So Florida, when you have a close election, and this one was very close, the end result was 537 votes, I believe, that George W. Bush won over Al Gore. And when you have an election that's close, one thing that happens, and this will be a running theme through my remarks, people lose all sense of logic, sometimes even ethics, because it becomes about winning. And they become very emotional. And in Florida, Democrats became very emotional. There were protests, there were people standing outside of courthouses yelling and screaming, and there's a lot of pressure on election officials, and it turns out that there were voting irregularities. And when you have a close election, all of those become very, 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 shall I say, emphasized. The biggest one, those of you who remember what a punch card ballot is, punch cards in that middle picture is kind of an example. It's what they used to program computers with back in the olden days. And so voters would go into a machine called a votomatic, they'd put in this card, and they'd use a little stylus, a little pin thing to punch out their choices. And one of the things that happened that was really unfortunate is, that led to this Supreme Court decision, is Palm Beach County, in preparing for the election, Teresa Lepore thought it would be helpful to her voters who were older to have bigger print. And because there were so many candidates in the presidential election, she had when you went into the voting booth, you had pages, and you would flip the page and you'd punch the thing, and you'd flip the page and punch the thing. And the presidential race went on 2 pages, and they called it a butterfly ballot. It confused voters. So what they found as they were going through all of the returns and everything is that Pat Buchanan, who was a Reform Party candidate, received in that county a irregularly large number of votes, like 35,000 votes. But this was a blue county, and he was a kind of probably, if they weren't going to vote for him, they probably would have voted for Bush. And so that was an irregularity that, of course, the Democrats focused on. Many lawsuits were filed. There was also some ethical issues. The Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, was the chair of the Bush campaign in 2000. Not any problem of conflict of interest there at all. And ironically, the voters a couple of years earlier had decided to make the Secretary of State's office appointed rather than elected. So she knew she wasn't going to run again. She had nothing to lose. So all of these things came to a head. It was ugly, it was unpleasant, and it finally came down to a case now very famously known as Bush v. Gore, where the Bush camp said, you know what, we got to stop the recount because the Democrats had selected certain counties to recount. And the court basically said, we're done. We have a timeline we have to hit, the election's over, it's final, and the takeaway from that I think most campaigns learned, and certainly the Democratic campaigns learned, is you have to be ready in case you lose to be able to fight it in court. And that'll play into my remarks in the next few minutes. One good thing that came out of Florida 2000 is the Help America Vote Act. This is one of the last times I believe the US Congress was able to actually pass bipartisan legislation. And it changed elections in the country, poured about $3.2 billion into election offices and modernized our elections. One of the things that it did is it got rid of punch cards, and many states went to touchscreen voting, which I'll come back to in a moment. The second pivotal race, and this one is very close to home for me, is the governor's race in 2004 in the great state of Washington. Now, this was a very contentious race, whole lot of dynamics. I could talk for an hour just on this election alone. Close election night, the Republican candidate is starting to move ahead during the certification or the canvass period as late absentee ballots that are valid are coming in. The margin is narrowing, but he's holding it. And by certification, Dino Rossi is winning by, oh gosh, I should look it up. Okay, I'm on camera. I've got to actually get the right data. Let's see. He was winning election night, I can't find it, so we'll just make it up, by about 200 votes. There we go. And so, of course, it triggered a statewide recount. And because of the way a glitch in the law, we ended up doing a machine recount first. And after the machine recount, Dino Rossi, the Republican, was still winning by 42 votes. The Democratic Party, of course, requested a hand recount. So the next 2 weeks we spent hand counting over 2.7 million ballots cast, and the end result was Christine Gregoire pulled ahead by 129 votes, the Democrat winning the election. Now, as you can imagine, the Republicans didn't really like this. By the way, both parties sued the Secretary of State's office the same number of times. I believe it was 6 each. And it was weird. It coincided with whether they were winning or not. And it's weird, the winners didn't actually file any lawsuits. So in that canvass period, as we were going through all the ballots and doing all of the things, some errors surfaced. Things like trays of ballots were found in multiple counties. Now, of course, immediately the rhetoric was, this is a rigged election. They're just ginning up ballots. They're just producing them. What it was, human error. And when you're in elections, you work in a world of mail trays. You have about 300 ballots in a mail tray, and someone had set a tray down, didn't have good internal controls. Some dunderhead decided to take the empty trays and put them on top of them as they were cleaning up, and no one realized ballots were there. Certification comes and goes. They get to the recount, and they find them. So as you can imagine, this didn't go over very well. So the Republicans are arguing that those ballots should not be counted. Democrats are arguing, hey, the voter did everything right. And in fact, I've been in many rooms in the 20 years since that I can tell you the only thing everybody can agree on in Washington is half the state believes that Christine Gregoire won and half the state believes that Dino Rossi was robbed. And you will never convince either side otherwise. Probably could say that about the 2000 election as well. I mention all of this because when I would go into Republican rooms 20 years later, they would still be hanging on to this. And they said, oh, those ballots. And so I would always pitch to them, okay, you have a tray of ballots, 350 people turned in their ballot on time, their signature matched, and they were eligible to vote. The only reason their ballot's not being counted is because someone made a mistake. Now imagine your ballot in that tray should be counted. And even then, usually they go, okay, I can see it. So I could go on and on about that race, but it was very significant in our state. It changed things. It's part of why Washington became a vote-by-mail state. Shortly after the election, oh, and I'm forgetting, the Republicans sued, and we had a 6-month-long court case that ended up adding 2 votes to Christine Gregoire's total, so insult to injury. And the election stood because the judge said that there wasn't evidence of widespread intent to, fraud or change the election. It was mistakes. It did make Washington better. We became a vote-by-mail state when we were getting ready for the upcoming legislative session. Auditors from both parties are in a room with the chairs of the committees that hear our bills. And they kept saying, well, what about doing this bill? What about doing this bill? And we kept shooting them all down. No, that won't work. No, that won't work. Finally, one of them got very frustrated with us. Well, what would work? And my colleague, Chris Swanson, said, vote by mail, because we were all being a little sarcastic. And then all the auditors went, vote by mail would mean running one election. vote by mail would mean we could concentrate all our efforts on a singular thing. And lo and behold, it took us about 10 years as a state, but we did finally get there, and we're better for it. So then the next election that I would say is probably significant as we go into 2024 is 2016. And similar threads. This, I think, has been shown to be actually where the roots of Stop the Steal came from. Some of the research has shown that. But from my vantage point, and by the way, I forgot to say, I'm a very biased election nerd. So my default is being the not even nonpartisan, the referee. I'm a referee since, probably I was 18 when I was officiating youth sports, and I've been that my whole career. So a lot of this may have that bias. So one of the most significant things about the 2016 election is this is the first time that we saw foreign actors try to get into our election system, specifically Russia. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But we saw cybersecurity threats for the first time. And of course, leading into the election, we were hearing things like the election's going to be rigged. That's the only explanation we can have for my loss. To, oh, there's going to be voter suppression, which would be the explanation for my loss. And I can tell you, campaigns do that because they're kind of, they're priming the pump. So if they lose, they have an excuse. It couldn't possibly be because we didn't do a good job. It couldn't possibly be because we didn't have a good message or didn't inspire voters. It has to be because of something that we had no control over. And let's face it, our country has a long history of voter suppression. And our country also has a history of voter fraud. I'll talk about those in a minute too, but both campaigns and campaigns across the country use both of those narratives of voter suppression and fraud to raise money and to cast out and to gin up their base. So following the 2020 election, Donald Trump won the Electoral College, lost the popular vote, and we saw things that we had not seen before. One of them, and it happened in Washington State and others, was what we call the faithless electors. When the Electoral College was convened in December, there were some Democrats that were trying to change the dynamic so that Hillary Clinton, people that were bound to vote for Hillary Clinton, would change it and try to get another Republican elected, is I think what their strategy was. It didn't work. And actually, we tightened up the laws, so now they are bound to vote for whoever the voters actually chose. And then, as I said, the foreign interference was a big part. Now, moving back to a governor's race. I always like to be bipartisan, by the way, in the way I talk about things. Another significant race that happened is the 2018 governor's race between Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams. This was significant on a few fronts. One of the things that happened, especially in big counties like Fulton County, there were very long lines going into Election Day and on Election Day, and voters were having to wait hours to cast their votes. And so they had also a law that was enacted that said that your ID that you had to show at the polls had to exactly match the data in the poll book. And if it didn't, your vote was put on hold until you came back and provided that whatever proof they were looking for in the legislation. So this, of course, all became this great narrative that there's going to be widespread voter suppression. And making matters worse, the governor candidate for the Republican Party was the serving Secretary of State. Again, no apparent conflict of interest, no perceived conflict of interest. Everybody was just fine with that.
But then Secretary of State Brian Kemp did recuse himself from his ballot.
He did. And Brian is a dear friend and a very ethical man, and he did recuse himself. So we get to Election Day, and Brian Kemp is ahead by about 60,000 votes. In the final county, he's ahead by 60,000 votes. But Stacey Abrams does not accept the results. And I think I mention this because I think she's kind of the first one that started this trend. And I think to a little bit, people would say Hillary Clinton, because in 2016, it took her a couple of days before she conceded. But Stacey Abrams, I think to this day, has never conceded this election. And it was the good thing that came out of that, though. At the time, Georgia had touchscreen voting. And what I mean by that is you went into the polling place, you touched your choices, you hit a button, and that was it. No paper ballot. So super efficient. It was great. We had results early. But now you're going to go back, and what are you going to count? Oh, you get to count the audit trail in the computer. And people really trust that. So the good news is that election did change. Georgia swapped out all of those machines for paper ballot, voter verified machines, and then we get into 2020. So 2020, as you know, Washington was the first actual deaths from COVID in March of 2020. You may know that at a nursing home. What you may not know is that was the weekend before our presidential primary. So we were trying to get the primary done so we could lock down the state. The governor wanted to lock down the state. So all of the things we had planned for changed dramatically, like all of our lives did. And then things that we saw in 2020 on top of that, because COVID and the pandemic wasn't enough, for the first time we started hearing the term MDM, mis, dis, and malinformation. And that was referencing particularly activities by our foreign adversaries to send out information that wasn't true about the election process or about voting in America or the results. And it was just designed to divide Americans. That becomes significant later. I'll get back to that. We, of course, had many people worried that this was going to suppress votes, that people were going to be too afraid to go to their polling places because they'd be risking their lives. Let's see, that wasn't enough. Oh, and then we started deciding that vote by mail might be a good solution. My election director and I got to be on many, many calls with people across the country. And then the President of the United States started attacking vote by mail, which was so cool. I'm lying, it was awful. And so I suddenly found myself getting calls from national reporters and outlets asking me to come and comment on the latest thing that Donald Trump had said about vote by mail. Oh, and the Postal Service was changing their operations. So let's see. Oh, and can't forget that people were saying that was going to be fraudulent. So yeah, it was so much fun. And then I think you all remember the aftermath and what happened. So election comes and goes. States certify the election results immediately. Right after election night, the Trump campaign is making a lot of claims about fraud, and this is a stolen election. It deteriorates, and I think you all lived through it, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. Probably the most significant thing was the Electoral College vote happens, in each of the states, and when they go to report it to Congress on January 6th, a date only election geeks really cared about, and maybe poli-sci people. And you all know what happened on January 6th. So there's been a lot of fallout and a lot of aftermath, but this was really building over a very long period of time. So how did we get here? How do we get there, and what are we facing going into November? So I think there's kind of groups of actors that have incentives that have risks and rewards. And so the first one is there are nation-state actors, and by that I mean specifically Russia, China, and Iran, who right now, as we are sitting here, are actively trying to make sure that we're divided. A lot of times people miss the subtlety of this. People believe that Russia or China or Iran are just trying to help Trump or help Harris or work against them, but take it a step higher. Their goal is to make sure that we hate each other, that we divide ourselves from within. Never lose sight of that. So that's one group of threat actors. The second group is cyber criminals. And I'm sure that no one in this room has, I'm sure everyone in the room has heard the term, the term I can't think of, where ransomware. Cyber criminals make a lot of money off of ransomware. And make no mistake, they're going to target not only institutions like colleges and individuals like all of you. They're attacking and they're trying to get into election systems for the same idea and hold things hostage and ransom and make money off of it. And then, of course, we just have people that want to disrupt things because they think it's funny to do a DDoS attack and bring down a website on election night. I say all this because these threats have been around since 2014. They are amplified now with generative AI. No one is quite sure what's going to happen, but we're all anticipating that AI is going to make it very cheap and easy for these actors, or whoever wants to try to disrupt the election. And by the way, risk reward, for those nation states in particular, it's great reward and very little risk. So they can spend $1 million on a bot farm, put out a whole bunch of things on social media to all of you that you think are coming from people that might be like-minded, when in fact they aren't they're not even people. And that's a lot cheaper than buying a tank or a plane or a missile, and quite frankly, more effective. All right, second group, kind of roll these all together, candidates, campaigns, advocacy groups, and attorneys. So a colleague of mine, who I won't name, has a term that he calls the suppression fraud industrial complex. And what he means by that is that there are many, many groups, many, many campaigns who make a lot of money telling you that there's rampant fraud and rampant suppression. And they tell you this because, one, it makes you write out a check. They raise millions of dollars. And two, it gets their voters to the polls. And I'll give you an example. I'm trying to think of bipartisan ones. I'll give you two. First example is Sidney Powell. Coming out of the 2020 election, Sidney Powell, an attorney on the Trump campaign, started spreading information and filing things in court that she knew were lies and were not factual. And in the biggest sanction in the court's history, I believe it was a US District Court, they sanctioned her, the judge sanctioned her $175,000 for the mistruths that she was doing in her filings. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. She made $16 million for her nonprofit following that. So there's talk about risk reward, that's a cheap investment. Pay a little fine, and we make millions. And to be bipartisan, you can see similar threads coming out of Georgia and Stacey Abrams' camp. Same thing. After the election, Stacey was everywhere. She was all around the country. She had a nonprofit. And that nonprofit also raised millions of dollars on a narrative that, you know, parts of it are true and parts are not necessarily true. All right, broadcast media, print media, online platforms, social media, I put them all together. Because one of the things that's changed since 2020 is when Republicans got control of Congress and the House, they started going after many of the people on that list to show that there was this conspiracy against Republicans, particularly on social media. I was at the time working for the Department of Homeland Security in CISA, and we were named in the suit. One of the suits out of Missouri v. Murthy, I think. And it was basically saying that the mis and disinformation campaign and education we were doing in CISA was actually trying to suppress American thought. We were censors. Now, we were absolved of that, but I can tell you it had a chilling effect on us. It's had a chilling effect on social media platforms. They are not moderating content in the way that they did in 2020, for good or bad. The scary thing is that they do have a place for time, manner, and place of elections. That's illegal. You can't say Republicans are going to vote on Tuesday, Democrats are going to vote on Wednesday because we expect long lines, because you could suppress Democratic votes. And I could do that in the other way and have the same argument. My point is that you can't do that. That's illegal. That's actually a felony. It's a federal crime. But the social media platforms and the online platforms are very now hesitant to do any kind of moderation because they don't want to be accused of censoring speech. And that's our greatest strength as a country. First Amendment right to speech. That's huge. The Russians know that, and they use it against us because they can say things too and say crazy things that we think might be real and true. And finally, in terms of risk and reward, for all of those media platforms, they make a lot of money when something goes viral. They make a lot of money even when they know it's not true. And so there's a conflict of interest there of, you know, should you take down content? Should you leave it up? Should you be monitoring it at all? And then finally, the challenges, and I alluded to these already, there's a lot of partnerships that have been formed through the years, particularly after 2016, between the federal government, cybersecurity agency. Elections were deemed critical infrastructure, so we could use federal funds to strengthen our security. Local officials, non-government organizations are all working in the space, planning for this upcoming election. But I can tell you that the last 4 years, because of the rhetoric, because of the narrative, all of these officials have been attacked. Threats against their lives, their families' lives. I could cry, but I'm going to go to the next one. By the way, we determined last night at dinner that an MPA degree makes you a weeper. So for students coming up, just prepare for it. If you are a poli-sci person, you're better at it. But MPA students and graduates, yes. All right, so with all of this, what should we do? So the very first thing, and this is for everyone in the room, but particularly for any students in the room, right now is a good time to go onto your local county website and double check your voter registration information, particularly if you moved from your address from the summer or last year. And students are the hardest group for this because you're so transient and you're moving every year when you go back home and then come here. And also be mindful of where you consider your residence. It obviously can affect your residency for tuition, so it's important. So if you are keeping your registration here for that, that's good, but make sure you vote here. And if you're keeping it back in your home state, if you're from another state, only vote in that state. But you can only have one. You got to pick. Highly recommend the Can I Vote website. This is a website that's sponsored by the National Association of Secretaries of State, so bipartisan organization. By the way, the oldest nonpartisan organization in the country's history, nonprofit. This has a wealth of information. You can find out information about all 50 states and how you can get an absentee ballot, how you can vote by mail, what the turn-in times are, everything you need, plus voter registration. Another thing I would suggest is if you're not doing anything going into the election, be a poll worker. I guarantee you that they need, trust me, right up until election day, we don't have enough people to serve at the polls, early voting centers. I apologize, I can't remember how much you have of that here in Utah, but I guarantee you that the local election office could use your help. And it's a really good way for you to see the process, see all the controls, see the balance and the bipartisan checks and balances that are built into the process, and you could become one of the best advocates for explaining why our elections are secure and accessible and fair and accurate. So I encourage you that. And then finally, there's a lot that's going to come at you online, on television, on radio, on Spotify, whatever your platforms are. And not all of it's going to be true or accurate. My recommendation is the trusted source for information on elections is always going to be your election office. Either your Secretary of State, in this case, Lieutenant Governor's office, or your local county clerk. Yes, clerk. But they're going to give you the information you need to make sure that your vote is counted and is returned on time and all of that. Okay, I have gone all over a whole bunch of things. There's my contact information if you'd like to reach out. And with that, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Okay. We'll take a priority for students, but please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll bring the mic over to you, and then you can ask the question. So.
And if you don't ask me questions, I get to ask you questions. So I'm just throwing that out.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the difference between maybe like a lapse in ethics in the case where we see maybe this pure profit motive or something like that, and a case in which maybe ethics as we understand is like adherence to the process or adherence to the rules gets subverted to someone's grander vision for what they think is right, where they see the means as justified by the ends. Because I think a lot of times we think that people are being unethical because we just don't share their ends. But they think they're being perfectly ethical.
Oh, absolutely. I think, we talk, in my household, we talk a lot about situational ethics, and I think it's from 20 years in politics. But, from my experience working with elected officials, working with candidates and campaigns, a lot of times they get so focused on winning that it doesn't matter how you get there, and that true Machiavellian kind of idea. I'll give you a couple personal examples. One, when I was Secretary of State a few years ago, there was a gun control initiative that was on the ballot. And it was becoming very controversial as they were gathering signatures. We were getting some rumors that the petitions might not adhere to all of state law. It might be illegal. And so, a lot of times that's just rhetoric. So they turn in the petitions, and sure enough, they are not adhering to state law. And now, as a Republican in a very blue state, I have to make the decision of whether I'm going to reject this petition that has almost double the number of, I think it was almost double the number of required signatures. It's going to pass, more than likely, unless they just have somehow done something illegal, which I knew they didn't. And it's going to be viewed politically. So, of course, I call my team in, I call my lawyers in, and we go through all the laws, and we do all the stuff. And so now I've made this decision in my mind. And I say to the group, okay, well, I think I'm going to have to reject this petition and we're going to come under fire. And my attorney said, Secretary, that's so cool. I don't think she said that because she was an attorney. Secretary Wyman, you can't reject the petition. Why not? State law, they're probably not in compliance with, but you can only reject for these 3 items, and they complied with those. You don't have the authority. Now, they can challenge it in court after the fact, but you can't reject it. You're going to have to accept it. So we make this public statement, and I get a call from a leading Republican in the Senate. And call went something like this. Hey, Kim, what are you going to do with the petition? I see you're going to reject it. I said, I'm going to. Gave him all the reasons why. Well, you know, you really should reject it. I can't. I just told you why. Well, you know, you need to show you're on the team. Team. I knew exactly what he was talking about, but I played dumb. Like, what team? Well, the Republican team. Okay, how should I do that? You just need to reject it. They'll throw it out in court, and it will still be on the ballot. I know, but you'll demonstrate that you're a real Republican. So winning twice statewide and 4 times countywide in a blue district doesn't count as a Republican? No. Cool. So you want me to violate my oath of office, break the law, so I can make a point and show that I'm on the team? Okay, thanks. I'll consider that. And I didn't, and you know, we never had a good relationship, so whatever. But that's an example of, you know, that you have these moments of choice. Sometimes they're very public. That one, parts of it were very public. That part was very private. But all those choices matter. And what I found through my whole political career is that I'll give you other side because I like to do bipartisan. A bill that a senator on the Democratic side came into my office, asked me to be executive sponsor of. I said, sure, happy to. Republicans are mad at me, but it's a good bill. Works through the system, gets onto the floor. It's in the hopper, and he calls me up. Hey, Kim, could you get the floor leader to pull the bill? So I call the floor leader. You know, hey, Joe, could you pull the bill? You tell the senator to walk across the floor and ask me himself, and I'll pull the bill. And I'm like, are we in 4th grade? What? Actually, 4th graders behave better than this. So I call the senator back. Absolutely not. Okay, you're an idiot, whatever. Okay, fine. Hang up, we move on. He lit me up on social media. That bill died because Secretary Wyman didn't champion it, and she killed it behind the scenes. Like, all right. Wow. And so, you know, and you pick your battles. And that was one where it's like, no, I know it's the right thing to do. And you're, you know, and it was probably a political setup. And that's part of the game now. You want to make the other side look bad no matter how good or bad they are, how much they align with you or not. We have a question up here. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's.
So one of our challenges seems to be that politicians want to, you know, specify that an election needs to be, you know, fair and free and safe and all these good things, but then they also want to reserve to themselves the power to decide whether it was, you know, free and fair. They're not going to take anybody else's word for that. Can you discuss the ethics of that?
Yes, I mean, it's the world we're living in right now. Elections in the United States, particularly because of the 5 elections I just shared with you, have really evolved, and election officials have really worked to professionalize the system. And by that I mean transparency is probably the most important key, that every part of the process, from when they start testing the machines in the beginning to tabulating ballots, making judgments on voter intent, to certifying the elections, it's transparent. If you right now want to get a list of people who are registered to vote in Utah, you can do it. Anyone can do that in the state, get that list. On election day, you can get a list of people that have showed up at a polling place and cast a ballot. So there's a transparency element that's overseen by bipartisan teams. All of these things are built in and baked in of multiple layers of security. Now, I think that, again, because the incentives are, one, you want to keep the narrative alive because, for example, Republicans talk about wanting to have good, clean rolls, and it was Republicans that went after the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, which was a project I was part of, that was cleaning the rolls by data matching. And it was nonpartisan, it was very secure, it was very thoughtful, and they shot it down, and a handful of states came out of ERIC But I think part of it is so that you can always cast out, because if you have something like Eric, you have higher confidence that the rolls are clean. And I think on the left, there's the same thing. That, you know, in Atlanta in 2000, in the 2020 election, there was a lot of talk about, you know, long lines and all these issues and voter suppression. And ironically, Fulton County is a Democratic-controlled blue county in leadership. So it's like, how is that possible? So you're saying Democrats are suppressing their own votes? And so no one kind of carries that out to the logical conclusion. And I think that, you know, now the lawmakers have figured out that we can keep changing the rules. Bipartisan Policy Center convened a group right after the 2020 election, 2020 election, and asked election officials, bipartisan, what are the things that are going to take us into the future? And one of the things that the committee recommended was, God, I just lost it. Lost my train of thought. Question.
About reserving to themselves the right to judge whether it.
Thank you. One of the things that was recommended by this group unanimously is that 90 days before an election, you have a quiet period. Lawsuits, more importantly, legislative changes. Because every little legislative change or rule change means you got to change all your processes. And that 90-day window is when we're getting ready to send out ballots to military overseas voters. We're getting ready to send out absentee ballots, getting ready to do early voting, getting ready for Election Day. And so it's one more thing. And so if you've been following what's happening in Georgia, that's one of the challenges of that election board that keeps adding last-minute changes. Election officials will rise to the challenge, they will do it, but you're putting other things at risk. And one of the biggest things election officials are focusing on going into this fall is running a good, solid, mechanically sound election. So that when all of the attacks come, and I will also plant a seed here, because I think there's a lot of focus by many people that, oh, this is all about when Donald Trump loses and the right's going to lose their mind or whatever. Make no mistake. Should Donald Trump win, Democrats will be just as emotional. I've said this to a number of my Democratic friends, and they all push back. And I say, okay, oh, Kim, we're going to follow the rules. We'll file court stuff, sure, but we'll stay within the rules. We won't do anything like protest or get violent. I said, yeah, I know you believe that. I said, so here's a scenario. Georgia goes for Trump. You're telling me all the narrative over the last, 4 or 5 years about voter suppression isn't going to be the reason? The stuff that the board is doing isn't going to be the focus? Of course it is. And that's going to make people angry. And then you have that gasoline on the fire with social media. So the Debbie Downer news here is I think no matter who wins, we are going to see ugliness. And it's going to be, and go back to that 30,000-foot level, it is going to be exacerbated by our foreign adversaries because they want it. So again, think about the trusted sources, figure out who your trusted sources are now. And when you see something online and it gets you really riled up, it's probably that. Yes, did I answer your question?
A lot of the recommendations that you had were at the individual level. What are some things at the systemic level that people who are in your types of role, your role or government administration, what are things that can happen systemically?
I think one of the things that the conversation that has to happen is funding of elections. So in my career in the 90s, I had to be an elections expert. By 2000, after the Bush v. Gore, I had to be an IT expert also. Then in 2016, I had to become a cybersecurity expert. And then in 2020, a comms expert. And I had to do all 4 of those things well to do my job well. That's not with any extra training, and that was as Secretary of State, but my colleagues and our election system, I failed to mention in the beginning, we have over 8,800 jurisdictions across the country that actually run elections and count ballots. Now, how much do you think the federal government gives to those jurisdictions to run elections, particularly, I don't know, federal elections? Nothing. So when you think about a ballot and you think about the real estate, when you go in, you look at your ballot when you get it this year, look how many federal offices are on your ballot. They don't pay, they tell us how we have to run the election, but they don't actually pay for that space. So the problem becomes, it now goes to the state and local level. So if you have a state that funds local elections, you are good to go. If If you're well-resourced, you're good to go. If you're Dean Logan in LA County, you have resources to do whatever you need to do. If you are Heidi Hunt in Adams County, Washington, with 10,000 voters, however, you have to do all the same things that King County, Julie Wise in King County has to do with 2 people. She has like 250 to 300. And all of that is because it's all localized funding. It's a local legislative body. So my first one would be we have to have a conversation about giving baseline funding to adhere to all of the laws and the things that the legislatures put on election officials. So if you're going to make election officials do something else, you've got to give them the resources to be successful. And let's face it, going back to your question, legislators were elected by the system that's in place. So they tend to be pretty protective of it and not really motivated to change it. And sometimes when they change it, it's because they think it's going to help them. And I can tell you that usually it backfires and it helps the other team, but don't let them know that part.
Okay, I believe we have time for one more question.
One more question. I will let you pick.
Okay, we'll go over here.
And I will be available afterwards too, so.
Okay, so I have a 2-part question, but I'll make it quick.
Okay.
My first part of the question is, what makes an election contentious? So what factors go into that? And then the second part of the question is, how can we make elections less contentious? And how can we specifically have a part as a voter towards making elections less contentious?
I think up until probably 2016, what made an election contentious was the closeness of the race. And I think 2020, it went out the window when Trump didn't accept the results. And I can tell you again, personal experience, I had a governor candidate, and I'm not making this up, who lost by 500,000 votes and disparaged me on social media, doxed me, filed lawsuits that he pulled as soon as we said you're going to have to pay the fees if you lose. All of those things, I think now it's okay to just say, I won. I don't care what the scoreboard says, I won. So that is what's making the contentiousness, and now we're in our camps. The other camp is evil, and our camp is just, and it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on that one. That's the rhetoric. How we dial down that temperature, I think it's a number of things. One, I think we have to have the ethical gumption to call out when what we're hearing is wrong. And it might be people that are in our families. It might be people that are friends, that are colleagues. Now that's part of the problem is when we do that now it becomes a fight. And facts will not convince people. I learned that out of 2020. You can give everybody the facts and they're still going to say, yeah, but it was rigged. How was it rigged? I just showed you all the controls we have in place. So it's having conversations and sometimes agreeing to disagree, but talking about the process and start at that local level. One is trusted voices. So some surveys have showed that the most trusted people in communities are law enforcement and first responders, firefighters, EMTs, faith-based community. I'm forgetting one. There's another one. And convening those groups and doing a tour of an election office. Go to your local election office and walk through. How do you secure the vote? How do you make it accessible? What are the guardrails in place to make sure it's accurate? All of those things, then the people that do those tours go out and can actually talk about it and talk about, actually, that doesn't happen in our county or our city or our town. So I think that's it. And I think the final one is really be thoughtful when you're online. Because I think a lot of this stuff is micro-targeted to all of us. And it is going to tell you exactly what it thinks you want to hear. And it's going to do things that are going to evoke emotion. And if you find yourself getting really angry or frustrated or irritated, that's probably a signal that you're getting played. And so maybe you need to take a step back and then check out other sources and see if what's said is real or if it's just clickbait. Does that help? Okay, you're welcome. Okay.
All right. Well, help me in thanking Kim Wyman. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you. She'll be here for another couple of minutes, so feel free to come up if you want to ask a couple of questions and connect with her. Students, we also have pizza for you guys back in the lobby, so please go stop by for a slice of pizza. And just thank you again for coming out today and supporting this lecture. Just want to thank a couple of folks, Victoria Medina, Jatara Greenidge, Melissa Warner, and our entire team in the Division of Public Affairs for helping us put this event together and all of the events for this week for our Ethics and Public Service Week. We have one more event tomorrow. We have a nonprofit mixer at 10 o'clock in the morning right in this space. So if you're interested in nonprofit work and want to connect with other nonprofit leaders and practitioners and talk about how to measure societal impact and leverage university community resources, come join us for that chat tomorrow. Thank you again.